Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. I'm David Shaw, the Publishing Director for Family Business Magazine. I hope that you and your family members are all in good health. Today's topic is philanthropy, and the discussion will center around formalizing your philanthropic activities and some approaches that you can use to increase the effectiveness of your philanthropy and also ensure your desired legacy and family continuity. We'll also examine how philanthropy and grant making can be used as a training ground for your NextGen family. Before we get started, however, let me take this back up here. There are some housekeeping details for you. We welcome your questions and comments throughout the session. Use the question box that you find down below, and you will be able to ask your questions or enter your comments at any time. We'll go for no more than 60 minutes today and get to as many of your questions and comments as we possibly can. Also, a copy of the presentation will be available to everyone after the event, and as will a copy of the slides. Those will be made available. So joining me today are two philanthropy experts, from Whittier Trust. Both Ashley Fontanetta and Channing Grigsby are vice presidents of Philanthropic Services for Whittier Trust, and they provide comprehensive services for clients who wish to begin a formal process of charitable giving, enhance their existing philanthropy, or explore new opportunities to increase philanthropic impact. Prior to joining Whittier Trust, Ashley worked as a financial advisor, responsible for developing wealth management strategies for clients and their families, and Channing worked as the foundation director at Kane Anderson Capital Advisors, responsible for all charitable giving, focused on employee engagement and business giving strategies. So welcome, Ashley and Channing. I wish you both a wonderful webinar here, and I will turn this over to Ashley to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So thank you for having us. We look forward to speaking with you today, and we do welcome questions. So please do ask away throughout the webinar, and we're happy to pause and take questions during the presentation and also have some time for questions at the end. Channing, next slide, please. We'll start by talking about the Whittier family and introducing you to their story, which is parallel to the story of our company. Next slide, please. So as you can see, Whittier Trust Company has a long history. We are the oldest and largest multifamily office headquartered on the West Coast. And we started as the single family office for the family of Max Whittier. Now, Max was an owner and operator of both real estate and oil companies here in California. Interesting little tidbit of history. He was part of the group that purchased and developed the land, which is now known as Beverly Hills. So needless to say, he did pretty well for himself. And Whittier Trust Company, as a family office, we formed around the needs of his family. When Max passed away, and the needs of his family and managing the inherited interests in those companies, till later on and generations down the line when they sold their oil company. And that large liquidity event led to the need for in-house investment management, and eventually our transition into a trust company, both here in California and in Nevada, not only to meet the needs of the Whittiers, but during that period of time, we expanded to begin serving the needs of other wealthy families. Today, we're serving just over 500 families across the country with a whole spectrum of their wealth management needs. But the Whittier family was always philanthropic. Going back to even the days of Max Whittier, he found ways to support his community and causes that he cared about. And so philanthropy has been a significant thread in the legacy of the Whittiers. Back in 1955, they established a foundation office, which is now a department that Channing and I work in, Philanthropic Services, as part of Whittier Trust Company. But the success of the Whittier foundations is one that we like to share because When the 4 family branches, the children of Max Whittier, formalized their philanthropy, they established private foundations. And those foundations exist today and involve Generation 5 of the Whittier family. And it provides a really nice backdrop for continuing to revisit the values and the history of the Whittiers that those generations now share. When you think about a family tree and how it grows and expands when you get to Generation 5, it's a pretty broad swath of individuals that we bring together now every other year around their family's philanthropy. We hold what's called a G5 retreat, and those now cousins get to come together and we talk about their foundations, we talk about their philanthropy, do education around the giving that they do as family. But it's also really kind of like a family reunion and a nice opportunity for them to gather and maintain that connection. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I mentioned formalizing philanthropy. You might wonder, what did I mean by that? Formalized philanthropy is really stepping away from checkbook philanthropy, where you're being more responsive to requests for grants, requests for funding, or maybe sitting at a fundraising dinner and you bring out your checkbook and make contributions that way. Formalized philanthropy usually involves the formation of a charitable entity, development of a mission statement, and really defining a strategy around what charitable impact you'd like to make. There are a few examples here of what that might look like. But what we see from decades of working in this space is that formalized philanthropy, most often done through private foundations or donor-advised funds, really develops a sense of responsibility and pride within a family that can be a very meaningful component of intergenerational wealth. Next slide. Now, many of you may be familiar with the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations saying, and unfortunately, it's a popular saying for a reason. As this study from Institute for Preparing Heirs shows, 70% of intergenerational wealth transfers fail by the end of the 2nd generation for reasons attributed to poor family communication and inadequate preparation. This image here shows that a lot of emphasis usually gets placed on the family's wealth and on the assets, less emphasis placed on the development of the family and having discussions around how to prepare a family for the wealth that they are to steward, not only for their lifetime, but hopefully to pass on to their kids and their kids. Next slide, please. So some of the benefits of formalizing your philanthropy, they're beyond the obvious, which are, there can be some significant tax and estate planning opportunities for establishing a charitable entity. But what we see is that it really creates memorable experiences around family values. It puts action to the words. You can talk about family values all you want, but what's much better and more impactful are the experiences a family can share living out those values, supporting organizations that espouse those values in the community, and being part of that and establishing that as part of what your family connects and enjoys to doing. Another important thing that we see is that it can create a level playing field for family members to come together and work collaboratively. Within families, not everyone has the same level of involvement, say, in the family business, or they may not share any interests at all, it seems. And so what we find is that by coming together around philanthropy and really intentionally talking about how to support your family's values in the community, there's a common ground that emerges. And that common ground and discussions around that common ground can sometimes repair or at least build relationships amongst family members. And it's also a really great environment for individuals to learn some important business fundamentals and things like analysis of investments in your charitable portfolio, how to read financial statements of the organizations that you're supporting, how to evaluate and vet nonprofit organizations that you'd like to support. It leads to an environment where it feels less like school, and is a more enjoyable way to talk about and teach important business practices in the context of philanthropy. Next slide, please. So some tips for success that we've experienced are, certainly start early. A lot of people ask me, well, when should we start? How old should our children be when we start involving them in our family's philanthropy? And I think the earlier the better. I've done grant making training for kids as young as 7, 8 years old, but certainly even before that or younger than that, inviting kids to the table as the adults are talking about your philanthropy. Let them listen to the conversations and how your decisions are made and why it is that your family connects and takes part in philanthropy together. That kind of osmosis of just being around those discussions has a big impact, and it keeps them interested in becoming involved as they get older. And developing family traditions around philanthropy is another way to just make it intentional and make sure that it happens on an annual basis. I find that dedicating Thanksgiving to having conversations around maybe making gifts as a family, or if you have a family foundation, hosting your annual meeting around Thanksgiving, when the family typically comes together anyway, can be a really special time to ingrain this practice in your family traditions. And in terms of involving the next generation, there's really no one size fits all model for success. I think the most important thing, though, is to take into consideration where the next gen, where they are in their life. We understand that through teenage years and into college, there are a lot of competing interests involving academics, sports, extracurriculars, relationships, and on into career. And so the next gen may not have as much free time or bandwidth to dedicate to really hands-on getting involved in your family's philanthropy. And that doesn't mean that they aren't interested or they won't be interested in the future. But I encourage some flexibility around their participation during those years where there's other competing priorities. But some models you might want to try are volunteering as a family, developing a family giving circle. What this looks like is that each participant comes in with, maybe it's $100. You can determine what dollar amount feels right for you. But each person contributes to a shared pot, which then they can discuss how to contribute that money, where to contribute it to, what organization they might want to support, and come to a collaborative decision about how their shared funds can make a larger impact through a larger gift to the organization they select. Junior boards are a great training ground for younger generations to understand board service and how to be a responsible and educated board member of a family foundation. Probably another opportunity that's maybe a little bit less intensive would be just inviting them to be an advisor on the family's donor advised fund. Comes with less requirements and probably more flexible for those that don't have as much time to commit. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we've talked about private foundations and donor advised funds. Those are probably, I think, the most popular options for formalizing your family philanthropy. And you may have one of these already, or you may be thinking about establishing one or the other. So this is a helpful comparison chart that we like to share, just to look at it, just a high level side by side. What are the differences and why one might be a better fit for you and your family? Now, just in looking at this, you might see that, well, the donor advised fund has fewer requirements and regulations than a private foundation, but that doesn't mean that they're always the better fit. I think it's important for families to first identify how it is they want their family foundation or their family philanthropy to look, what they want their personal involvement to be, what type of assets they're planning to contribute, There's what type of involvement they want their kids to have, what type of grants you'd like to make. All of these things are important to think about before going down the path of establishing either a private foundation or donor advised fund. And the reason is this: if you start with a private foundation, you can transition to a donor advised fund later down the line if you'd like. It's not without some effort. It takes some work, and it's certainly not simple to wind down a private foundation, but it can be done, and you can transfer those assets into a donor advised fund if later you find that that's a better fit. But if you start with a donor advised fund, you cannot transfer that back to a private foundation if down the line you realize that maybe a private foundation would have been a better fit. So I share that to say that it's not a black and white direct comparison of the two vehicles and you have your answer. I encourage you to spend a little bit more time thinking more about your unique family situation and what it is you'd like to get out of this experience to make sure that the vehicle you select is the right fit. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So there's another quick side-by-side that showed whether or not, yes or no, some questions you might want to ask about establishing a donor advised fund. But just to reiterate, I think these are some other questions that you might want to ask yourself and ask your family and anyone who will be involved with your philanthropy to think through these questions before you choose to establish a private foundation or a donor advised fund. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it over to you, Channing.
Awesome, thank you. So Ashley gave a great kind of explanation of the, donor advised funds. And, as she mentioned before, you got to kind of have some good family conversations, decide kind of what the goals are, kind of, to determine which kind of works for you. The private foundation definitely has a lot more kind of oversight, a little bit more attention to detail. You have, have to have a board of directors. You have to have annual meetings. You make sure that everything's filed correctly with your both state and federal governments, all that kind of stuff. So it really this kind of has a little bit more kind of oversight that you want to be sure you're ready to do. It always is hard, unfortunately, at Whittier, we're actually handling this with a client who she's actually not a philanthropic client, but she has an outside person kind of helping her all that kind of stuff. She came across an issue with a filing that didn't get filed. And now we have to we're trying to help her kind of figure out how to make sure all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. And that can be kind of difficult just because, with bureaucracy, it does take a little bit of time to get all the ducks in a row, that kind of stuff. So you want to make sure that if you are going to go the private foundation route, it's a great way to go. But just make sure you kind of are ready to have all those tools in place to make sure that you kind of have everything handled correctly for it. That is the nice part about kind of, I guess, a shameless plug for Whittier is that, we are able to do this for a lot of our clients, make sure that, we have all their stuff, kind of all of the annual filings handled, all the meetings requests kind of done, all that kind of stuff. So it's just something to think about to make sure that you're ready for kind of the more kind of detailed oversight. So we can kind of talk about this, but there is stuff, as you saw on the first slide, that, one thing I forgot to mention on this one was one of the perks of a private foundation is board compensation, whereas a DAF, you can have no expenses that are related to it. So if it's a great training ground for all this kind of stuff for people to kind of get their feet wet, you can actually have board compensation. So that could be a plus for someone who's learning and trying to kind of establish a career, which is pretty nice. The other thing I wanted to talk about was that with a private foundation, you can have kind of a buffer around solicitations for grants and such. All people who are really giving, they want to give, and people come to them. They've great. There's so many amazing organizations out there. It can be hard to kind of decide where you want to focus your money, all kind of stuff. So having a formal foundation kind of allows you to create some parameters and a mission and a focus that kind of gives you a, hey, what you're doing is fantastic, but we are kind of focused on education or a different area. It does kind of provide a nice little buffer around some solicitations for money that can come about. I'm going to let Ashley kind of talk about some of the tipping stuff and the 5% distribution, all that kind of stuff.
Great. So we've outlined private foundations, we've outlined donor advised funds, but in some cases, the right solution is to have both, both entities. There's some good reasons for this. They work really well together. One thing we see quite often is that it can be difficult to make grants in the amount of 5%. Private foundations are required to distribute 5% of their net asset value at the end of each year or throughout each year. And that can be actually hard to do. And so one solution we found is that if it doesn't look as though the board has identified the right organizations to distribute that amount of money to, you can allocate remaining funds into your donor advised fund. That does qualify as part of your 5% distribution to satisfy the requirement of a private foundation. And then the funds in your donor advised fund do not have a time limit on when they need to be dispersed and do not have a minimum required distribution. So you can hold on to those for later until you've identified the right organizations and how you'd like to support them. Another reason to have both is that maybe you have a private foundation already, but you've identified that you'd like to make a charitable contribution of appreciated real estate. And if you look back at that side-by-side comparison, the chart of the two entities side by side, you'll see that the deductibility for contributions to either of these entities is different. The contributions to a donor advised fund receive and benefit from the maximum level of tax deductibility for your charitable gift for a variety of assets, because the donor advised fund is considered a public charity. There are higher limitations, I guess, and lower deductibility amounts for gifts to private foundations. So with a gift like appreciated real estate, we do encourage that you consider making that contribution into a donor advised fund because, of course, you'll benefit from higher level of deduction. Now, this is an important point that not all donor advised funds are operated in the same way. They are hosted by what's called a sponsoring organization. And not all sponsoring organizations allow you to do things like name unlimited generations of successor advisors, or they may not be willing to accept and hold certain types of assets. You may have different investments available to you in various platforms of donor advised funds. So we encourage that you shop around a little bit and find a donor advised fund that's the right fit for you. Read the fine print, understand the operation of them, understand what they can and can't do, because you'll find some differences. And sponsoring organizations can be anything from community foundations to banking institutions. And so they operate quite differently. So we do encourage that please do spend a little bit of time making sure that the DAF you open is on a platform that's the right fit for you and your family. Donor advised funds grants also allow for anonymity. Private foundations are entities that are stewarding public funds, and your family is the board is responsible for those funds, and you have to file an annual tax return which is accessible to the public. And so we've had experiences where a board wants to make a grant or a board member wants to make a grant that the family would rather not have printed on their publicly available tax return, which is called a 990-PF. And so what we encourage is that you have a donor advised fund, you move the funds into that DAF and make your grant from there, because a donor advised fund can allow for anonymity. Of course, the fund would have to be named with something other than your family name to really accomplish that, but it certainly can be done. So if anonymity is a concern, a donor advised fund is a great vehicle to use, maybe in concert with your private foundation. It can also be a good fit if a board member wants to make grants that fall outside of your foundation's mission. You can use the donor advised fund for that. And then lastly, it avoids what's called tipping for nonprofits. And I won't spend a lot of time on this topic because it doesn't happen all that often, and it's a little known rule out there for nonprofit organizations that are public charities that the IRS wants to make sure that to qualify as a public charity, they receive broad public support. And so anytime they receive a large portion of funding from just one individual, that can be an issue for them. It could tip them from public charity status back into private foundation status, and they'll lose some of their tax benefits for that. So we do encourage that if you are choosing to support, especially smaller organizations, and your contributions on an annual basis may start to add up to 2/3 or more of their total annual support, it's important to keep an eye on that and connect with the organization, make a plan for how to make those gifts to them appropriately to avoid tipping, or simplest solution is to make that gift through a donor advised fund. Because the donor advised fund is not attributed to you as an individual, those gifts are held by your sponsoring organization. It's a nice way to avoid the potential for tipping your nonprofit grantee. Next slide.
Couple of quick questions, Ashley, based on that. First, I think you addressed this already, but can a private foundation donate to a donor advised fund? I think you said yes.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was one. And then when you're shopping for DAFs and comparing them, what are some of the questions you think should be asked to see if it's the right fit for the family?
Yes, I think one of the first is, how many generations would you like your family to be involved with this donor advised fund? And what does that family tree look like? If you have multiple generations in mind, or you want the ability for successive generations to name their own advisors, it's important to ask the donor advised sponsor, how many successor advisor generations will they allow you to name? Some only allow for maybe 2 or 3 transitions, and then they may incorporate the donor advised fund into their general fund to benefit the greater community. And so if you want this fund to be part of your family philanthropy for forever or for generations, it's important to ask that question. It's also important to ask what type of assets they're willing to accept. If you have assets that you may want to contribute and hold, better understand the way that those assets are managed on the DAF platform. And that leads to another question, which is, what investments are available to me? It's good to take a look under the hood and see what will make up your DAF portfolio, because of course it's able to be invested and grow tax-free over time to maximize the potential of your charitable giving. So understanding that is important. And then any other questions that you might have about the types of organizations you'd like to support, making sure that you're qualifying them in advance, because donor advised funds are only able to make grants to 501c3 public charities. And some organizations that you might like to support could have a different classification. There are organizations that I think there are 29 different categories of 501cs. And so making sure that in advance of going the DAF route, that the organizations you want to support are in fact 501c3s.
Excellent. Okay. I have other questions, but I'll hold fire for a while.
Okay.
So we are going to speak on family continuity now. And this is obviously a very important point. You want to make sure that through the entire process, you are creating a situation with your family that is kind of welcoming, accepting, and not making starting a private foundation or even a DAF kind of a contentious issue, which can be kind of hard sometimes because people have different focus points that they want to get across. They have different missions that are really near and dear to their heart. So some best practices that we have seen is, as Ashley mentioned kind of early on, was having conversations, right? Making those conversations an early practice in your family, starting young, that kind of stuff, and kind of asking kids, where they're, what's on their heart. For example, my nephew loves animals, so he has been really interested in giving to the World Wildlife Fund, that kind of stuff. So and he's 9, right? So he has different ideas. Obviously, those will grow and evolve as they get older. But in those conversations, kind of through those conversations, identifying kind of what the philanthropic mission is going to be, kind of, can you guys come to a consensus on kind of a specific area? Identifying the goals. Do you want to give, larger amounts of money to a smaller number of organizations? Do you want to give smaller amounts to a larger number of organizations? And then also kind of seeing, what roles people want to play, right? This is an important conversation to ask people. How involved do you want to be? Is this something that you want to kind of be something that you're doing all, kind of your priorities, or something you'd want to just show up to once a year or once a quarter, whatever it is. So really kind of allowing for a very genuine, open conversation is very important. In that same light, really empowering the younger generations to have a voice. Sometimes if you, have a head of a household who has been successful, sometimes younger generations feel a little intimidated to want to participate because they, kind of feel like maybe they should just kind of fall in line. So really encouraging younger generations to have that voice, even if it's on a smaller scale, just allowing them to kind of slowly integrate into the process and kind of find their voice, whether it is a private foundation or a DAF. And a DAF can be a really great kind of safe training ground for this. And they can, as they understand, they learn how to research the right, research organizations, do the site visits, do the follow-ups, all those kinds of things. They really then get an idea for what it kind of takes to maybe be a board member, going forward. Any points here, Ashley, you want to touch on?
No, you did a great job. Thanks.
So as we talked about with the empowering of the younger generations, this is a good time for me to give kind of a real life example. We have a family who is a multi-generation family, and currently one of the generations is kind of in charge, but they had a death of let's call it Gen 3. And so the daughter of a Gen 3 person, so she would be Gen 4, is asking to say, okay, so am I taking my mother's spot? Well, at the board meeting, they were kind of talking about, well, it's not really, is Gen 4 kind of old enough? Are they ready? Kind of what are those conversations going on? And so it's really important to kind of understand and, for each generation to think about a succession plan and to say, okay, at what point do we think the next generation is ready? Is it 18 years old? Is it 21 years old? Is it, kind of when whatever it is, right? To kind of just have those conversations so that there's a plan in place, so that, it does kind of alleviate a little bit of some issues. So it's not just a personal decision. It's kind of, all right, let's have an established rule to say when each generation becomes 18, they join a junior board, or they start being the ones to make suggestions and doing site visits and presenting research or whatever it is, but really giving them a role and really deciding what the role of each generation is going to be. So we've kind of given that a little bit to say, okay, the head of the household kind of, is bringing all the generations in to kind of have conversations, and then allowing a training ground for each generation to really learn and grow, learn, how to speak their voice, but also really take notes and understand to see what the, previous generations are doing. And also learning to say, okay, hey, I noticed that you guys are doing this way. I just learned about this. Can I offer a suggestion? And really just kind of making it a very big family conversation that really is helping each generation, and that's not only in family philanthropy, but as well in family business, right? Having people understand the mission, understanding the nooks and crannies of the business, understanding all these things to make sure that when it's their time to take over, they are really kind of moving the mission forward. And of course, there'll be tweaks and adjustments here and there, but for the most part, you want the general idea and the general mission to really be carried on from generation to generation to generation. So it's really important to kind of have those conversations early and also empower the younger generations and really have them understand it from the get-go. So I will let Ashley kind of walk through this as it's a little bit of a real life example.
Yes, thanks, Channing. So yeah, I can't reiterate enough what Channing was saying, that it's important to have the experience and training for the younger generations and experience in working together on succession. But one of the things that I think is challenging for a lot of the clients we work with is just how to start the conversation, about, getting involved with the family's philanthropy and what that looks like. And so it can be really difficult, just like it's difficult sometimes to talk about money. It can be just as difficult to talk about family values and how you'd like to see those values lived out. So this is just a sample agenda that we put together for a family meeting that we've used for clients. And we put a structure to it. This is just a kind of a snippet of what the meeting entails, but the structure we put in place helps facilitate the conversation. And it starts with the older generations talking about, what are my wishes for you, my family? What are the values that we have and I'd like to see passed down in our family? What would I like our legacy to be? And, then my wishes for me. What are some of the things that I would like to have done in my final years? Things related to my health and my lifestyle, and what kind of support would I like to see from you, my family members? And then lastly, what have I prepared for you? And this is a nice introduction to talk about trusts that have been set up for the family, or various assets that are meant to be maintained and shared among generations for the future. And having these conversations, it gives you a forum to talk about these things, so that it gives you a reason, I think, to go into and delve into these topics. But more importantly, everyone's together, and it gives the opportunity for discussion, for questions, for the raising of concerns around what the plan is for family wealth. And the outcome of this is that everyone feels involved, informed. The older generations are able to set the tone, but the younger generations are involved in the discussion because they'll be participants in carrying out this vision. And we found this to be very successful in taking what can be a really difficult conversation and putting a nice streamlined format to it. This is also a great opportunity then to talk about philanthropy and how philanthropy ties into the family's legacy and how it is that they would like to continue to live out their family values for generations. Next slide.
One point I forgot to mention, I just want to make sure I touch upon, was for best practices, a good conversation would also be the conversation around having independent individuals on a board. Sometimes that can provide some nice oversight. Can also kind of help keep the mission on track because there's no emotional kind of tie to it as they aren't part of the family. And it kind of also maybe help to alleviate some family tension that can come, and especially as generations pass, people move on. There's always emotion that gets tied to that, and so one conversation would be to have is the discussion of, do you think that your board needs some independent individuals to be on it to just kind of provide some of those things for you?
Great point. Okay, so now we'll close out with talking a little bit about how do you use philanthropy as a tool for teaching various practices and fundamentals of business even. So I like to point out that philanthropy has, in the nonprofit sector, kind of has its own vocabulary, but a lot of it can be translated directly into more traditional business speak. So just to point out a couple examples of that, we talk about leadership in nonprofit organizations. Well, that's management. Evaluating a strategic plan. A strategic plan of an organization is their business plan or their business model. What we call sustainability, you might call scalability. And so there's a lot of ways in which, getting to know how to vet and assess nonprofit organizations and proposals as a grant maker through your donor advised fund and through your private foundation can directly relate to training you may want to do in the realm of the family business and in context of the business that potentially you may want your younger generations to become more involved in. A lot of the concepts are largely the same between the nonprofit sector and traditional business. Next slide. It's also kind of interesting that in grant making, we could use that term interchangeably with investments. And so if your interest is in teaching your younger generation about investments, grant making can be a nice, safe tool to use and to do that. There are a lot of ways in which, making a grant in a nonprofit organization can be directly related to the research you may want to do on a company that you're interested in investing in. There's also things like recoverable grants, which allow for funds to be returned to your charitable entity that you can then redeploy. There's also something called a program-related investment, which is something you can make from a private foundation and is pretty unique because you can make a grant to a for-profit entity as long as it satisfies some requirements. I recommend don't do this at home on your own. Always involve somebody who's a knowledgeable expert in the area of PRIs if you'd like to go that route. But what's really cool about it is that you can engage in a debt or an equity investment in a for-profit company that's in line with your mission. And imagine the experience that your board members can have in participating in that way, all the while using your charitable dollars. So it provides it lessens the risk, I think, a little bit, because if, for example, that company isn't profitable and doesn't provide a return to you, you think of it as a grant that helped them, further the work that they're doing that you believed in from the start. On the next, I have an example of a PRI I'll walk through. So this was a private foundation that was already engaged in supporting medical research. And they had a family member who was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. So that became a primary focus of theirs, is what's being done in this area, what type of research, what kind of diagnostics are out there. And they found a startup company that was working on some experimental testing using, as you can see from the picture, scanning of the eye. And so the foundation was actually able to utilize a PRI, program-related investment, to invest in this startup company and help them to really further their research and continue with their stages of development. And in this case, if the company is successful and they generate a return to the foundation, that money then needs to be redeployed as a grant out into the community again. So it's really a dual benefit. They've helped to support and further the work of a company doing work that they strongly believe in and that aligns with their mission. And then the return on their investment turns into additional grant making funds that they can go out and use to support another cause they care about. So it's really a win-win. Next slide. Just another example, one of the families we worked with, this was a family that has their own business, and generation one came to realize that the generation two was not probably going to be so interested in taking over management of that business, but they were going to participate as board members and shareholders. And so the family was interested in how can we help to develop the business skills of G2, but in a way that doesn't doesn't put them on the spot, doesn't make them feel intimidated, because it relates so closely to the family business that they didn't feel as though they could really take over. So they formed a family foundation, and they said, okay, G2, we want you to manage this foundation. We want you to be in charge. We're going to step aside, step out of our shadow, give you room to grow and to thrive and to be successful. And they certainly have. They've really found their footing, their voice, in being the leaders of this foundation. That's really made a big impact in the area where they live. It's given them kind of a status and a source of pride to represent their family in this way in their community. And they've now inspired their kids, G3, to want to serve on this foundation board. And so they're doing their training right now by participating in a donor advised fund, which, as I showed earlier on the slide, has fewer requirements and regulations. It's a little bit of a safer environment to serve on the board because you don't have fiduciary responsibility as you do on the board of a private foundation. But so that G3, they're training and they're going to step right up onto that board. It's been a really positive example of how to build confidence and competence amongst a family member group that will eventually serve on the board of the family business. Next slide.
Yep.
It's another great story. Okay, so this one it's another family we were working with, and this was, a few generations down. So we're talking about generation 3 and generation 4. Generation 3, they were very interested in supporting veterans causes. That was very meaningful to them and, tightly related to their family values. But their kids, generation 4, they were not at all aligned. They didn't have that personal impact. They didn't feel connected to that cause. And so generation 3 was struggling a little bit to get G4 involved in their family's philanthropy. So they asked us to help out, and we identified a unique grant making opportunity. It was through a vehicle of a social impact film that the foundation could support. And this was a documentary about veterans returning and reintegrating from their service. And it was really exciting for G4. They were intrigued by the opportunity to work on a documentary and see the behind the scenes, what that is all about and what goes into it, and be kind of like, producers of this documentary. And in doing that, and in being involved in hearing the stories of the men and women who were being interviewed for the documentary, and getting to know the organization that was being profiled in this film, G4 did have that personal connection now with the cause. And they had a greater understanding of why their parents chose to so strongly support the men and women who serve our country. And so G4 developed in their own way an affinity for veterans causes, and brought them back into a place where they were excited about supporting this. They were excited about supporting the organization that was profiled in the film, and it solidified these family values that were part of the foundation's mission. So this family now was very grateful for that experience and opportunity, and they're in a great place now, continuing to move forward and find more opportunities just like this to support with their philanthropy. And so I'll wrap this up just by saying that, we shared a lot of success stories today, obviously, because those are the fun ones to talk about. But philanthropy is not a silver bullet. Right? It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't repair all relationships. And it doesn't always lead everyone back to the same, path and to align behind one set of values. But I will say that it's worth trying. And it's worth engaging and inviting family to come together around philanthropy. If it's not a home run right away, maybe adjust and try again. There are no shortage of people that you can call upon for support. Philanthropic advisors like us, people are available at your local community foundation who are experienced in this area, have worked with families just like you, and can help you navigate your own course. So that's all for me. Thank you. I'll pass it to you, Dave.
There's some questions.
Great.
First, and this one's been hanging for a while, so I apologize for waiting so long on this, but when you were talking about DAFs and foundations, is there a minimum regular balance or initial donation required for a foundation versus a DAF?
I'll let Ashley take
it. Yeah, thanks, Tanny. It's a question we get a lot. And I think it requires the donor to do a little bit of kind of back of the envelope math on the cost to set up their foundation and what that results in.
Did we lose you, Ashley?
Nope. Can you hear me now?
Okay. No, of course. Yes.
Okay. Well, so what I think is important to do at the outset is to determine with the amount you'd like to contribute to your foundation, what are the costs to establish and set it up? What is 5% of that net asset value going to be? And that's likely going to be your distributable amount. You can always give more, of course, but that's the minimum that you have to put out the door. And is that going to be enough? Is that enough to make an impact? Is that enough to support the charities that you want to support? And go from there. There are costs, of course, associated with establishing a foundation, more so than a donor advised fund. So for lower balances, you may want to just start with a donor advised fund. You may want to just do that. But again, you can't turn your donor advised fund into a private foundation down the line. So we tend to encourage our clients, our relationship minimum at Whittier Trust is 10 million. So we're working with ultra high net worth individuals and families. And we tend to see private foundations starting around the $7.5 million mark. But there's no exact science to it. It's what feels right and it feels best for your family.
Okay. That raises there was another question, which is if you're formalizing your family philanthropy, are there other ways to do it outside of using either the private foundation or DAF vehicle?
Yes. There are a lot of different nuanced ways you can have a grant making or charitable entity. There are scholarship funds that you can establish. There are things called designated funds. There are field of interest funds, many different varieties that accomplish generally the same thing, but have slightly different variables to them and types of grants you can make. I would encourage that you contact your local community foundation or a philanthropic advisor to discuss the different options available to you. A lot of it too depends on maybe other factors like your tax planning, what type of assets that you'd like to contribute. So it's a pretty comprehensive review that should go into determining other options that might be a good fit for you.
Okay, terrific. You've talked about that junior board concept, and can you give some best practices on how to create one and make it work?
I think that one of the best practices for this is honestly open communication and seeing how involved whether it's a younger generation or whatever it is, that how involved they want to be, and then having them form a junior board as a training ground. But I think the open communication is a great place to start, because sometimes people form a junior board, and as you saw, with the veteran organization example, they weren't, crazy about that, and that wasn't where their passion was lying. So putting them on, creating a junior board and being like, here you go, here's a junior board, if they're not kind of passionate about it, that can be, a little bit hard to kind of force someone into it. So really open communication, really understanding to say, okay, what is it that you are interested in? How involved do you want to be? If you don't want to be on the board, do you want to be researching the organizations, or however, whatever those kind of conversations look like? But I would just say open communication is one of the biggest keys to forming a junior board.
Ashley, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, another thing that I experienced was that we had a junior board. They were given an allocation of $10,000 each to make grants, and they weren't doing it. They weren't using that money, and the board said they just must not be interested. They're just not engaged. And I challenged that and ended up calling the NextGen. I had called the junior board and talked with them a little bit about, you have this allocation. Can I help you in making those grants? And what I learned from talking with all of them is that they were actually very interested, but they were stagnant because they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to start. They didn't know how to vet an organization. They were so concerned with doing it correctly, with making an impactful grant. They would rather not make any grant at all than make a grant that wasn't used properly or went to an organization where it wasn't going to make a real difference. So what they really just needed was some support. They needed some help to understand the best practices of grant making. And today I'm happy to report that every single one of them uses up all $10,000 that are allocated to them.
Okay, terrific. Well, speaking of boards, this was brought up earlier, having independent board members being helpful in certain cases. But what do we do if we disagree on our philanthropic goals and can't find any common ground? This sounds to me like a family that has some other dynamics issues as well.
So this is a family who is having some disagreement?
I'm guessing, given the way it was asked, yes.
So in the example I gave about, kind of the generation passing, that board does have independent board members. And I will say that in that conversation, those independent board members did a really great job of being like, hey, this conversation seems to be going this direction. Let's recall, this time, and let's bring it back to this mission. Let's bring it back to this focus. And kind of all the independent board members really did was provide kind of some guardrails a little bit. So I think it also is important to find the right independent board members who really have an understanding, have the right personality for it, and are really there as a way to kind of provide some guardrails, say, hey, this has seemed to turn into a personal conversation. Can we kind of let's kind of steer it back into talking about the board and the mission and that kind of stuff. So I think as independent board members, it just is mostly kind of putting some helping to bring the conversations back and keeping it away from the personal, and just really making it about kind of the focus of the foundation.
Terrific. Okay, we're coming to the top of the hour. I wonder if you have a kind of a key takeaway for our audience.
I can speak to that. I would just say, give it a try. Give philanthropy a try. And if you already have an entity set up and you're already engaged, and maybe like the person who asked that last question, it's not going as you anticipated, there are a lot of options and other routes you can take. Some are very simple and some become more complex. So try the path of least resistance first and change things up if they're not working. It's your entity, it's your family, legacy to create. And so I think the most important thing, though, is not to give up, not to throw in the towel. Just find different ways to go about it if it's not working. But the benefits far outweigh, I think, any negative issues that might arise. So my key takeaway is to give it a try. Don't feel you have to go it alone. Find some help. Find someone out there. Find an advisor or another family that also has a foundation. Talk with them about how they do things, and continue to learn about the best practices that fit you and your family.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Channing. Thank you, Ashley,
Of course.
for sharing your time and your expertise today. Um, if you out there would like to explore other opportunities to train your next gen, consider our upcoming Family Business Next Gen event. It's our second annual gathering of Next Gens. It'll be held online on a Friday, half day, easy for Next Gens to do. So please do encourage your Next Gens. And for those of you who are attending Transition Spring 2022, I look forward to seeing you next week in Tampa. So in the meantime, I'm going to wish you all a good day, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.